Okay, so I want to talk about a miraculous healing that I think I witnessed earlier this week. Unfortunately, I'm doing this from my microphone at home because the audio on the walk I went on this morning was not working. So I'm going to leave the video from the walk with Toby, but I'm going to try to talk about what I talked about on the walk. So, to summarize, I took Toby to the vet to check his eyes. The vet was concerned, the one in town was concerned, went and did an ultrasound, without my permission, mind you. Came back, told me he's got 5 months to live, he has spleen cancer. I was shocked. They were wanting to prescribe him steroids for, the remainder of his life, 6 months or whatever it would be. I didn't, and they said they could for $1,700 remove his spleen, but I said he's too old. I don't want to take the risk of him not waking up from the anesthesia. And they said, well, there's chemotherapy, and they said that's anywhere from $4,000 to $10,000. And I was like, well, that's not really an option. I don't have that. So I was basically left with the options of steroids and watch him die in the next 5 months, and that's it. I was devastated. I needed to also say that the vet was showing me pictures of his spleen, and she's like, see this grainy texture? And I'm like, yeah. She's like, that's bad. See how his spleen is enlarged? I'm like, yeah. It's like, that's also not a good thing. She said, and you see this white circle right here? I was like, uh-huh. She was talking about how that's the tumor, that kind of stuff. Now, when I went home, I was skeptical. I was also in denial, to be real. And so when I went home, I started to research this stuff. And I was looking at pictures of spleen cancer, and everything I always saw was like black circles, but what I saw was a white circle. So already I saw some kind of discrepancy. And so I thought, you know what I saw is just an object. It could be a fluid-filled cyst. It could be a number of other things that I looked into. It didn't necessarily have to be a malignant tumor. So I was skeptical that first week as I was looking into this. Eventually, I did read about how stage 1 spleen cancer shows up as like an unidentified object. And I was like, oh man. So that's when it dawned on me that maybe what I was looking at was stage 1 spleen cancer. That's why there were no symptoms. That's why. I also read that 2 out of 3, there's a 2 out of 3 chance that when you see something like that in the spleen, that it's usually it's malignant. It's cancerous. It's not benign. And I know how my luck is. I do not get that 1 in 3 chance. I get 2 in 3, So it could be 1 in, listen, my dog who passed 3 years ago, she died from a condition that was 1 in a million. 1 in a million dogs will die from IMHA. And she died from IMHA. So literally, my odds could be 999,999 out of a million of surviving, and I'll die. That's my odds. So 1 out of 3, that's way worse, 1 out of 3 chance of living is way worse than 1 in a million chance of dying, So I'm already thinking, you know what? I had to look into chemotherapy. Now, I also need to say that during that week when I would go on walks, I would just say, as I'd go on the walk, Toby has no spleen cancer. And every time I said it, it felt right. It didn't feel like I was just saying this to feel better or make, it felt true. I said this statement and it rang true. And I said that every day on a walk when I went out here. Anyway, back to the story. So I schedule him an appointment for UT in Tennessee, in Knoxville. And, I did forget to mention, before I did all this though, it was the same day. I did call the vet and I said, listen, is there any way to test to see if this thing is cancerous? Because I read about a fine needle test. And they said, oh no, we don't do that because there's too much of a risk of internal bleeding. And I thought, and removing his entire spleen isn't a risk of internal bleeding? And they also said that they have to do an anesthesia for the fine needle test. Well, I looked into that, and no, you don't. You don't even have to do a sedation sometimes. Usually just sedation is enough. So they were lying to me about that. I called them on that too. I said, look, I looked into this, and you don't need to do an anesthesia for a fine needle aspirate. And they're like, where'd you get that from, Google? And I'm thinking, what kind of If it's public knowledge, yeah, you're going to find it on Google. You could probably just call any vet around here and they'll tell you, you know? So they were playing games. They only offered an x-ray as a possible way of seeing. But that's not going to tell me if it's cancerous, you know? So they weren't really giving me any ways to know if it was cancerous. They were just saying $1,700 surgery or good luck for the next 5 months. He'll be gone in 5 months. And I was really distraught by this. Like, these are awful options. Anyway, I'm going down to Knoxville now to take him to UT. And when I'm in the way, okay, so I got there at 8:30. They checked me in. They'd seen him by about 9. It was a 9 o'clock appointment. And so they took him back to start doing all the scans and all that stuff. And when they took him back there, that's when the prayer just began. I mean, when the last of your dogs and your best friend is, and you don't know what they're going to come back, they come back and say anything. They can say he's got cancer in his lungs and his heart. I mean, it could be a nightmare, you know? So there was a lot of prayer going on, let me tell you. And I just remember asking, and here's the thing. I asked God to heal Jenna and Faith, my 2 dogs from 3 years ago, and they were not healed, and they both passed. And that's when it was a real big hit, and it made me really afraid. It made me just think that prayer was useless and that it was hurtful to ask for help. It was hurtful because I knew what the answer always was, no. And so for the last 3 years, I began to think, does God change things or not? And I thought, no, he doesn't change things. Everything, the past, present, future, it's set, and prayer is mostly useless, I really thought, for these last 3 years. And that it is, you can't change the outcomes, and all you're really doing is changing yourself to be able to deal with the outcomes, or maybe unlocking something in your brain to understand how to solve a problem, but you're not, like, I just believe for the last 3 years, God doesn't change things. But then I was always conflicted with that, because I thought, if that's true, but at the same time, you know, the apostles reporting that he's walking on water, he's feeding the 5,000, he's rising from the dead. I'm like, that's an example of how God changed things. So there was kind of like this conflict between what happened in history and the beginning of Christianity, where there was proof that God actually did change things, versus my own life experience, which up to this point seems like he really didn't change things. But you know what? That's unfair. The story how I came to this house actually might be an indication that God does change things. It's not very common. It was needed. It was necessary. It was the next step. It was not very common. I don't want to get into that. It's another story. But for the most part, especially these last 3 years, I just thought, no, God doesn't change anything. Well, God may have changed my mind this past week. So on Monday is when I was in Knoxville, and I'm in the waiting room, and there was a point where I was praying and I was asking God to heal Tobi. And kind of like how a lieutenant would almost ask a general, that Tobi is a needed asset. He has a purpose. Unlike, the other 2 dogs that passed, Jenna and Faith, I just didn't want to lose them, and I didn't want to say goodbye. But I couldn't really argue that they had a purpose anymore for being here. I mean, Tobi still has a purpose. He keeps me going. He's the reason I get out of the house. I wouldn't go anywhere if he wasn't around. I still believe that he has a purpose, and I was asking God to heal him because I think it's just too soon for him. It's not his time yet. And there was a certain point, now keep in mind, it was storming and raining and thundering all since that morning, really all night. And it was around 11 o'clock in the morning to 12. There was a certain point, and I was just praying nonstop. Well, the storm stopped. The storms cleared. The white clouds started rolling in. The sun started to come out. It was also around this time that I started to just feel like it was done. It was done. And any bit of prayer I was doing after this point almost felt like futile. Like I keep putting a request in when it's already been answered. And then I thought, I don't need to pray anymore. He already heard me the first time. I don't need to keep going over and over and over. He heard me. It's done. That's just a feeling I had, is it's done. I got a call around 12 telling me that his tests are done and that it's going to be a couple hours before they'll have the results and all that. So now I was just waiting. Around 2:30, I got a call from the woman who worked. What they do there is they have a doctor working with like a fourth-year student. And so the fourth-year student was the one that called me. Just let me know that here's what she says. She says, well, we got the results and we need to talk. It's like, oh, man. Anytime a woman tells you we need to talk, it is always bad. If it was good, they would just say it. So when she said we need to talk, I'm like, you gotta be kidding. I felt like, man, I'm exhausted from this. Like, I was starting to fall into doubt and despair. Like, you pray and it's just like nothing ever works out. Like, just feeling that prayer is useless. When she said we need to talk, I'm like, you don't. Who says that, And so then I go into the room and I'm already kind of preparing for he's got cancer everywhere. And they don't have Tobi in there with him either. So this is also, I feel bad. Like, normally if it was good news, right, they'd just be in there, right? Anyway. So they're in there and they got all the pictures up on the screen and they're showing everything. And so then they show me the pictures of the spleen and they say, so Tobi doesn't have any cancer. Tobi has no cancer. They say, but he does, however, have kidney disease. And they're both smiling. And I'm like, so this is good news? And they're both nodding their heads like, yeah, this is very good news. This is a lot better than we thought it could have been. And I'm like, so my dog has kidney disease, though? They're like, yes. And he's like, yay? Yay, my dog has kidney disease. Yay. I just didn't understand how to weigh out the difference between kidney disease versus spleen cancer. And spleen cancer is basically he's going to be gone in 5 to 6 months. Just because also how it spreads so quickly, and there's no guarantee chemotherapy will work, even though early stage, from what I read, there is a higher chance. There's like an 80% chance that it'll work. Later stage, it gets less and less. So, but kidney disease is common, and as long as from what I was reading, as long as you don't feed them anything with phosphor, keep them on a low sodium diet and also a low protein diet, that their kidneys should be able to cope. So they didn't say what stage, now that I think about it. But anyway, so that was a very strange thing, how they were smiling about how he had kidney disease. And I didn't understand that. And they were just smiling because he didn't have any cancer. So that's back to the subject. Tobi had no cancer. Every walk I said, Tobi has no cancer. And it felt true. When I prayed that day in the waiting room to clear, any cancer in Tobi, and to ask God to heal Tobi and to heal him and remove any cancer that he had. Now here's the other wild thing. I looked at those pictures of his spleen. It didn't look anything like the pictures I just saw 3 weeks prior. His spleen was not enlarged. There was no grainy texture. There was some stuff in there, but it didn't look like the white circle that I had saw. And so I'm trying to process this, Did I just witness a miracle? The vet in town was so sure that he had cancer. And after reading enough about it and thinking about what I saw, I was pretty convinced that's probably what it is too. I was willing to go start chemotherapy over it, basically. That's why I was at the oncology department at UT, because the vet and me were both convinced he probably has spleen cancer. But I saw that picture of his spleen. It was perfectly fine. No cancer. Let that sink in for a second. Now, I know the skeptic out there is going to say, well, you just had a really bad vet in town. I know. I play both. I listen to both sides of an argument. I know. And it is the more natural explanation and simple explanation. But I do remember what I saw 3 weeks ago, and I do remember what I just saw earlier this week at UT. And it was different. There was no grainy texture, there was no enlargement, and there was no like round circle like I saw. It was very different. Someone said, well, that vet must have just shown you a picture of another dog. You would think. I find that hard to believe. It's possible, sure, but I just find that hard to believe. I may have witnessed a healing. Now, I've never seen a healing in my life. Like I said, I lost my last 2 dogs. Even though I asked for a healing, nothing was given. And I need to explain that it seems as if though God does or can and does change things, but it's rare. And it's for a purpose. Toby still has a purpose. And this is going to sound kind of mean and cruel, but Faith and Jenna didn't have a purpose anymore. They just didn't. They weren't meant... Like, I've gone everywhere with Toby these last 3 years, just him and me. If I had 3 dogs, I probably would not have done that. They would have all been at the house, and it just would have been... Everything would have been different. Toby has a purpose still. Jenna and Faith didn't. In fact, Jenna and Faith passing is actually what caused me to start doing all these recordings the last 3 years and really start to reflect, study, change, everything. Really take life and death serious. Really take my beliefs serious. I hate to say this, but Jenna and Faith, it's almost like Jenna and Faith had to die for me to have a wake-up call. For me to wake up. Their death actually was probably the greatest purpose to get me to wake up. Because before they had passed, I was so caught up in this world, the ways of this world, the distractions of this world, trying to find a female, trying to make money to get a female, because that's how it is, sadly, in the West. It's basically, it's prostitution out here. You have to get money for a woman. You have to have money to have love in your life, and it's not even really love. So I was caught up in that whole mentality, that whole mindset, trying to acquire resources and that sort of thing. Shamefully, I'm admitting this. I really am ashamed that is how I was before this happened. When Faith and Jenna passed, that all ended. The futility of all those meaningless pursuits was so obvious to me. I no longer cared about any of that stuff. And so that's what I mean when I say, and this is a small way of me saying that I hate to say this, but Faith and Jenna had to pass away for me to wake up. My whole life is different now because they passed. Toby, on the other hand, was meant to live. And I think this is why Jaith and Fenna, wow. Jenna and Faith, they finished their purpose and they were meant to pass. And I've seen them in heaven. And I know they're okay. But they were meant to pass. There was a reason for their passing. That Father in heaven knew that the hurt I was going to go through from losing them was worth the change and gain from not only just myself, but others throughout the rest of my life. And that it was worth it. It was you risk a pawn to gain a knight. You risk a pawn to gain a rook. It's a chess move. You do it. You know, Jenna was like a knight and Faith was like a pawn, and the chess player decided it's worth losing a pawn and a knight to gain a queen. And that's how you win chess games. You do that kind of math. You know, God the Father did the same thing with his son Jesus' life. That it was good. It wasn't good that he died, but it was a sacrifice that God saw as worthwhile. Just as Jenna and Faith and the change they brought into my life was worthwhile. Jenna was 13, Faith was 9. I felt bad about Faith because of how she passed so young. But anyway, but I think Toby still had a purpose, and I think that may have been what was different between why he was healed, but why Jenna and Faith weren't. He still had a purpose. So I was thinking a lot about this. If this was a miracle, why? Why was Toby healed and Jenna and Faith not healed? Now then something strange was happening now. after all this happened, I started to think about this. I thought, that vet in town, they prescribed him steroids, but with his kidney condition, that would have killed him. But they didn't even bother to check his kidney condition, so that's some negligence there. Their diagnosis. Now, here's the sad part about their diagnosis. Technically, it was wrong, but what if it was right and he was healed? And then can I really be mad at them? If I think about that, let's say they say, okay, he's got spleen cancer, and I agree eventually. Then I ask God to heal his spleen cancer. So now he doesn't have spleen cancer. How could I be mad at them for diagnosing him with spleen cancer when I also asked God to heal his spleen cancer? So because that's the skeptic in me that's thinking, well, what if this wasn't a miracle and they were just really bad at their jobs and they misdiagnosed him? Okay. I have to let that go. I do. People are not perfect. They make mistakes. And if I ask God to heal Toby, how could I be mad at them for saying he has spleen cancer? Then I wouldn't have even known what to ask God to heal him for, So I'm not upset about their diagnosis of spleen cancer. I am upset that they prescribed him steroids without checking his kidney function first. That is really upsetting. And they also lied in the referral. They said that they said that they offered me options like a fine needle aspirin. They said that in the referral. The doctor over at UT told me that. She emailed me that and said that in their referral, they said that they offered me options like a fine needle aspirin to determine if it's cancerous. And I said, that is absolutely false. And there were people there who witnessed that conversation when I was asking if they have ways of seeing if it's cancerous or not. So they were also lying, committing fraud on the referral, and they were being negligent when it comes to prescribing him steroids. So I begin to think I might have a case here. But this is where I was falling into a temptation. I just witnessed possibly the first healing in my life where I asked God for his help to heal, and he responded, and he healed. And I'm going to taint this now with a lawsuit, with bitterness. No. And this is where I began to realize I think I'm being tested here now by the devil to see if I will turn to the other cheek. I just paid $1,300 because of their bad diagnosis, so that's some damage right there. Toby could have been killed if I had just followed their plan of steroids. That's risk. That's the chance of loss right there, massive loss. So they did do me wrong. Negligent prescription, lying on their referral, about giving me options that they weren't giving me. And like I said, their diagnosis, the skeptic will say they just diagnosed him wrong too. I will say maybe they did diagnose him right, God healed him. That's really what it comes down to. Was Toby miraculously healed? Or did they get their diagnosis wrong? Or show me a picture of another dog, So now I'm being tested. Can I turn to the other cheek? They did me wrong. They did me harm. But as I look at it now, Toby is fine. What harm was really done? I know, $1,300. I know. I've had no income for years. So that's not some small amount. That was what I was going to live off of for the next 6 months, Can I turn to the other cheek? What did Jesus say? Something that I'm going to paraphrase. If they take your jacket, offer them your shirt too. It caused me to lose $1,300. So in theory, I should go and ask them if they want more of my money. So I'm being tested. Can I turn to the other cheek? The problem that I've noticed with a lot of these tests in life, the devil is very sneaky. He likes to use a sense of justice to justify mercilessness, unforgiveness. That's what he does. I've had this happen many times in my life. Many times. Where the right thing felt wrong and the wrong thing felt right. Someone say, oh, you should lay the hammer of justice down on these people for everything they just did to you. Well, I'm saying that Jesus taught us to turn to the other cheek and let God deal with justice. Let God and the system that He has created to deal with those who have done you wrong. It is perfect justice and perfect sentence. Be blameless is what Jesus taught us. That's part of turning to the other cheek, to be blameless. To just take the hits that this life throws at you and just keep moving forward. This says so much more about you and your place in heaven. And I can feel God's love right now as I'm saying these words, because I know what I'm saying is true. This is how to be great in God's eyes. To take the damage from this world like you just take hits, like a boxer that just takes hits but doesn't throw them back. Just take the hits and keep pushing through. Keep standing, keep pushing through. Be blameless. You went through this life. Hopefully you've asked God for forgiveness, forgiven of your sins, and you've spent the rest of your life committed to not hurting anybody. To just try to get through your life not hurting anybody, you know? It doesn't matter if you're justified. It doesn't matter if they did you wrong. The whole thing is, can you go through this life and leave justice to God? Can you not hurt anybody? And so this was, I think, a little trick and a test and a temptation. Can I turn to the other cheek? You know what the reward is if I can turn to the other cheek here? I can go the rest of my life believing that God did heal Tobi of his cancer. Now, if I were to go and be petty and start a lawsuit and all that stuff, just to try to recoup some money, then I would have to accept that this was just about the vet being wrong, that he never had cancer in the first place, and the vet was just really wrong about it. And that's what I would begin to think then the rest of my life. But if I think that God healed him, then that would mean that I would think that the vet was right, that she did see something that looked cancerous in his spleen. That's why I took him to oncology in the first place. So who am I to then try to sue them, like I said earlier, for thinking that there was cancer, but then God changing it? And I know that sounds wild, especially for a skeptic or anything like this. Okay, some of my recordings are kind of meant for all audiences. They're like more philosophical and that sort of thing. But some of these recordings, like this one, is definitely for more people of strong faith. This is definitely not one for people who are very skeptical, because, like I said, I myself still have some doubts about everything that happened, but I'm trying to have more faith in this matter. I do think, though, that I was definitely tested by the devil after all this happened, trying to get the whole temptation of get a lawsuit, sue them. They did you wrong, now do them harm. They did you harm, now do them harm. Tit for tat, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. But Jesus says, but I tell you, to not resist an evil person. Turn the other cheek if they take your jacket off from your shirt too. And I know that's the way. I know that's the right thing to do. I know it. It's just hard to do that sometimes, It really is. Especially when that, like I say, that loss that I just had, that I was going to live off that money for the next 6 months. They just emptied me. So there was loss there that I'm going to have to now experience and feel for the remainder of this year. Full disclosure, there was money funded from a GoFundMe account to help pay for this, but I still ended up paying a good portion of the bill. So I do want to say that for anybody who thoroughly investigates the matter and say, he had a GoFundMe for this, and no, it did not cover the whole thing. I ended up paying about a little more than a third of the whole thing. So, which is actually making it a little easier for me to also not try to seek revenge if I had paid for the whole thing. I actually didn't have the money to be able to pay for the whole thing, so there's that. So it wouldn't have even happened. This whole thing wouldn't have happened without the GoFundMe. So, but anyway. So I think that's the end of it. I think I witnessed the miracle. My bud right here, he's old and he's still trying to make it, and I'm gonna try to keep him on a good diet for having weak kidneys. But he's got no cancer in him. He may have had cancer in him 3 weeks ago, but he doesn't anymore. This was just something for me. I couldn't expect anybody else to believe this. That's fine. This is not a resurrection of the Savior kind of event. This is just for my own personal life kind of thing, you know. I think it's likely I witnessed the healing. I think I witnessed the miracle. It's likely. It's wild. And it also answers my question of, does God change things? Yes, he does, but the caveat is it's not very common. Doesn't happen often, but he does, and there's usually a very strong reason for it that you find out later on. So, all right, until next time.